I call the Honourable Minister David Carter.
Mr Speaker, it's a pleasure to take part in the budget debate and a particular pleasure to follow that member, the Labor member Stuart Nash, because he was the man who ran that despicable story about the dairy farmers not paying enough tax. He was the man that single-handedly made sure every farmer in New Zealand comes out on November 26 and votes National. Because that man went out there and said the dairy farmers don't pay tax. He picked 2009, the year of the drought, the year of Fonterra's lowest payout in recent years. In fact, many of the farmers you talked about had actually been entitled to a tax refund in that year, and yet he went out and compared their gross income and stupidly, foolishly suggested that dairy farmers should pay tax on their gross income, not their profit. Well, that shows how out of touch that Labor member is. It shows how out of touch the Labor Party is with the farmers of New Zealand. And then Mr Goff did better than that. He had a big conference here in Wellington. Mr Nash might have gone to it, because I understand as soon as he could, he then flew to Argentina to get away because he wasn't prepared to show his faith in New Zealand. Ronnie Biggs did that. Ronnie Biggs went and lived in Buenos Aires. At least Mr Nash came back to face the music. But Mr Goff then announced they'd bring agriculture back into the ETS in 2013. Why? Because they're having trouble with their budget and they need $800 million. That is $23,000 per farmer. No problem when you've annoyed every farmer in New Zealand by telling them they don't pay tax, to then go and say we'll expect them to front up and pay $23,000 per sheep and beef farm, per dairy farm, so we can fund some other R&D tax credit. That was the policy of Mr Goff. I've no doubt Mr Nash helped put it together because he's the revenue spokesman. He's the revenue spokesman. So the farmers who are listening tonight, if Coronation Street is boring, I say to them, mark my words, Labor's talking about a capital gains tax. Labor's talking about bringing the emissions trading scheme in 2013 at a cost of $800 million to that industry. And they're also going to restore the envy tax. That's the tax where anybody earning over $60,000, according to Mr Nash, according to Phil Goff, is rich and should pay a higher rate of tax. Well, I'm proud of what this government's done with tax. We've now got 2/3 of every taxpayer in New Zealand paying a top tax rate of 17.5%. Mr Speaker, I do want to just acknowledge the valedictory speech we had before dinner break of John Carter. He has been a tremendous parliamentarian. He was the person who supported me through my by-election in 1994 and made sure that he gave me every support to get in here. We will miss John Carter for his humour, for his hard work and for his absolute dedication to this House. In talking about the budget, Mr Speaker, I will acknowledge it was a tough budget. But it was a budget for the time. It was a budget that wasn't a typical election year. We didn't have to hand out lollies like that government did in 2005 that this country's still paying for. We were fiscally responsible, something that Mr Nash and Moana Mackie wouldn't even understand. This was a budget for the time. And I still remember, and I will never forget, for as long as I'm on this earth, Michael Cullen crowing when he opened the books before the last election, saying, doesn't matter who wins, 10 years of budget deficit. That's the mess, the legacy of the Labor Party left to this country. And full marks to Bill English, full marks to John Key, full marks to this National Caucus, because we've got that deficit back and we're predicting budget surpluses in 2014. That's a lot better than the Labor Party left, and they should be silent and they should be ashamed of themselves. Because, Mr Speaker, this budget also made a tremendous contribution to Christchurch. We're still struggling, particularly after Monday at about 10 a.m. when we got another 5.8 aftershock. But this government's made a commitment of a total of $8.8 billion booked in this budget, $5.5 billion associated with the rebuild of Christchurch. And the Labor members of Christchurch continue to go around looking for hard luck stories, trying to criticise this government. But I can tell you, Mr Nash, they're on a loser. Because the people I'm talking to are respecting the commitment of John Key and the national government to Christchurch. Mr Speaker, the budget of 2011 was about economic growth. Because history will show, if the Labor Party ever wants to look at history, and Shane Jones should look at history before he is history, go back and look, Mr Speaker, and this economy, the tradable sector of the economy, went into recession in 2004. That was long before the world had heard of the global financial crisis. Mr Nash denies it. Still today he denies the tradable sector was in recession in late 2004. That's the mess. He hangs his head in shame. Of course he does. Mr Nash hangs his head in shame, and I don't blame him, because he should be ashamed of that performance. And what we've now got is we've got an economy coming out of recession led by the agricultural sector that Mr Nash hates. He hates the farmers. He's full of jealousy, but he's not the only one on that seat that has on that side of the House. They all hate the farmers. It's the politics of envy, as displayed by Mr Nash recently. So what we now see is this year GDP growth at 2%, not good enough. Next year at 4% and building from there on. Mr Speaker, this is a budget that builds on the productive base of this country, the agricultural sector. It was the Labor Party, Steve Chadwick, that termed agriculture a sunset industry. Remember that, Steve Chadwick? Right. You had finished school by then. David Longy, 1988, and he called agriculture a sunset industry. Well, the farmers of New Zealand haven't forgotten, and I'll make sure, Mr Speaker, they never forget Labor's commitment to agriculture. Mr Speaker, I want to talk about one specific announcement around water that was in the budget. It was announced the week before the budget itself, and it is this government's commitment to a sustainable use of water. That is New Zealand's greatest primary sector competitive advantage. And as a nation, we've made a mess of utilising that resource for a long time. So in the budget, we tagged $35 million to encourage the development of agricultural schemes. We signalled we'll put $400 million into future investments in irrigation schemes. $400 million. But it won't be irrigation at all costs, Mr Speaker. We announced a national policy statement on water quality and quantity, something that hasn't been done by the previous government, despite 9 years of promises to do so, 9 long years of promises. And finally, we announced an enhancement scheme. This government, with the enhancement scheme announced in the budget, will now commit a total of $268 million to tidying up some of the degradation of our water. This was a budget for the times, Mr Speaker. I'm proud that we're fiscally responsible. We made changes to KiwiSaver. Mr Nash talks about us cutting KiwiSaver. Well, we've made a change to the tax credit. The members' tax credit has been cut by half from June next year, Steve Chadwick. So we're saying to the people of New Zealand, go and vote with that information. And if you support the National Party and its progress around a growth agenda, rather than the politics of envy from the other side, then vote accordingly. And Mr Speaker, I believe at this stage the polls suggest to me most New Zealanders are being very fiscally responsible. They know this country has overextended. They know this country went into recession in the tradable sector in 2004 under the mismanagement of Helen Clark. They know that Helen Clark still ticks on a regular basis members of the Labor caucus to give them instructions. It's no wonder the Labor Party is still polling at around 20%. And until they detach themselves from the failed policies of the past decade, then they've got no show of delivering to this economy an economic growth that will give to New Zealanders the standard of living they deserve. And I'm making sure, as a member of the National Caucus and the National Government, this government continues to focus on economic growth and on the standard of living of all New Zealanders.
I call the